There are boundaries, sharp edges where science, logic, and the reality we think we control simply end. Today, we will look at the stories of two different women living on two different continents. Between them were thousands of kilometers, different languages, and entirely different beliefs. But the darkness that found them spoke the same tongue, because for certain invisible forces, belief systems are not an obstacle, they are merely looking for a host. One was Anneliese Michel, living in Germany. The other was Ceyda T in Ankara. Two different lives, one terrifying and fatal end. Now we descend into the depths of that dark journey that took hold of the bodies and souls of these two women. What you are about to hear may send shivers down your spine. If you are ready, let us begin. Lost facts. Anneliese grew up as one of three sisters within the deeply conservative structure of Germany. For her family, religion was not a lifestyle, but an unquestionable set of rules. In an atmosphere where prayers never ceased and rigid rules made the air heavy, Anneliese was only 16 years old. At that critical threshold, the most vulnerable time of searching for her identity, her mind and body began to shatter with unexplained tremors. First came the uncontrollable seizures. Those moments where she threw her body against the floor and lost consciousness were initially cleared to the medical world, temporal lobe epilepsy. However, all the heavy medications prescribed by doctors were not enough to bring back Anneliese's fading light. On the contrary, it was as if every dose of medicine further enraged something else inside. Then it wasn't just the seizures, the voices began. Anneliese started talking about foreign voices howling inside her ears, screaming that she was damned. She was no longer just an epilepsy patient. The hospitals changed their course and the diagnosis changed: schizophrenia. Yet even schizophrenia protocols could not pull her out of this darkness. She refused to eat, threw herself to the ground, and soiled her home with loud screams and vomit. Traditional medicine had hit its limit. The hospital management discharged Anneliese, stating they had exhausted everything they could do. When her family brought her back home into that heavy religious discipline, no one realized that what they had experienced so far was merely a trailer for the horror that was about to begin. When medicine proved helpless, only one option remained for Anneliese's family: faith. However, the prayers recited inside the house were no longer shields. They were like triggers. Anneliese reacted pathologically to holy water, crucifixes, and prayers. Her body would convulse at the sight of a cross. To resolve this situation, the family sent her on a prayer pilgrimage to Italy, along with a religious family friend. But in those holy lands, it was not the expected miracle that occurred, but horror. Anneliese refused to step foot inside the church doors. She would vomit when offered holy water and experience crises of unprecedented violence when faced with a crucifix. When the journey ended, there was more than just fear in the eyes of their companion. There was a definitive judgment. You think this is a disease, but you are wrong. What is inside her is not epilepsy. It is something else. For the family, these words meant the total collapse of their already shaken world. If doctors could not treat her, the only remaining path was to enter the darkest corridors of the church. They immediately knocked on the local bishop's door. "We are requesting permission for an exorcism." For the church, this was not a request to be taken lightly. The diocese had to reach a decision on this unprecedented case. On one side was a young girl whom the medical world called schizophrenic, and on the other were the cries of a family rejecting that explanation. The church sent the documents to the archbishopric to make that major decision. To the church, exorcism is a form of spiritual surgery. However, the surgeons of this operation are priests, and the patients are those deemed possessed. Before the Catholic Church approves this extremely heavy and dangerous process, it wants to be 100% certain that the case is not merely a psychological disorder. The sharp criteria set by the Church to conclude a case is demonic were as follows: speaking languages fluently that the person never learned, superhuman physical strength, recoiling at holy objects, revealing hidden information or past events that the person could never know, invisible changes in facial features, bodily distortions, and the voice taking on a non-human tone. Anneliese met every single item on this list in a terrifying way. Facing this heavy evidence, the local diocese could not resist much longer, and on September 24th, 1975, the first priest knocked on the door of Anneliese's home. Gemini Shunadetta. The 10 months following that day turned into a nightmare where a young girl slowly faded from the world. Between 1975 and 1976, the priest performed a total of 67 separate rituals, some lasting 4 to 5 hours. During this process, Anneliese was exhausted, not only spiritually but also physically. She stopped eating, refused to drink water, and fought not only with her own body, but also with those dark forces believed to have possessed her. Her face collapsed, her gaze changed. She made bone-chilling sounds, and she harmed living creatures around her, even insects. It is even known that her kneecaps were shattered during the rituals. On July 1st, 1976, this 10-month depletion ended with Anneliese's death. For the family and the priests, this was a bitter finale to the war against evil. But for the world, it would be a fierce legal battle lasting for years. What left that house on July 1st, 1976, was not just a lifeless body, but also a massive question that put both the medical world and the church in the defendant's chair. When the prosecutor's office opened the file, they called it negligent homicide. The autopsy reports were horrifying. Anneliese weighed only 30 kilograms when she died. The cause of death was recorded as collapse due to starvation and dehydration. When the trial began, the lawyers defending Anneliese's family were directly appointed by the church. This was because it meant the trial of not just a family, but the church's practice of exorcism. The audio recordings echoing in the courtroom became among the darkest auditory evidence in history. In the recordings, besides the voices of the priest and Anneliese, there were bone-chilling growls heard when no one else was in the room, as if dozens of different voices were howling and challenging each other at the same time. The priest recorded this as the fight among the demons themselves. The most striking moment was the testimony given by a medical doctor regarding Anneliese's exhausted state. The change the girl experienced was such a physical and sharp deterioration that it had become impossible even for the doctor to explain it with a medical diagnosis. The court only sentenced the priest to a fine. The prosecution's objection that she could have been saved if intervened a week earlier remained inconclusive. The family was left unpunished by German laws on the grounds that they had already suffered enough. Anneliese was buried in a cheap coffin. However, when the grave was opened and her body was transferred to a heavier metal coffin, a fire suddenly broke out in the house where her family lived. That house, the place where Anneliese's life was extinguished, turned to ash. Anneliese's story ended here, but the question of that dark force seeking a host she left behind reawakened thousands of kilometers away in a quiet house in Ankara. This time the stage was not rituals managed by a priest. It was a modern and terrifying mystery that began in the safety of a family's own home. Ceyda T and her husband Sinan were a happy family living in their own small world with their young daughter Berku. Until that night, Ceyda would suddenly sit up in the deepest part of her sleep. Her eyes were open but vacant, moving with that dark rhythm of mumbling, incomprehensible words. At first, her husband Sinan thought it was a kind of sleepwalking. He would gently lay her back in bed, trying to console himself with Ceyda's words the next morning, as she remembered nothing and said, "It must be exhaustion." But as the nights progressed, the restlessness inside the house became tangible. Ceyda would stand in the middle of the hallway at night, her head bowed, her face lost under the shadows, waiting for hours. Then suddenly, as if slapped by an invisible hand, she would be tossed through the air and crashed to the ground. Bruises appeared on Ceyda's face like the mark of a hand, along with burns and rashes, on various parts of her body. Hospitals, tests, expert opinions. The medical results were clear. Ceyda was physically perfectly healthy. However, the thing inside the house had now begun to touch not only Ceyda, but the entire family. One night, Sinan jumped out of bed breathless, under the pressure of invisible hands wrapping around his throat. In that panic and horror, when he turned his eyes toward the room, he found Ceyda standing at the foot of the bed, saying something in that familiar, mumbling voice. While Sinan questioned the reality of the choking sensation he experienced, he realized that the silence behind the walls of the house had now turned into a threat. The sentence, "Something is moving in the room," falling from little Burku's innocent mouth, brought the family to the final edge of terror. Now, the youngest in the family could also sense that invisible presence in her own room. Sinan struggled as the concepts of jinns, hauntings, or supernatural explanations clashed with his rational worldview. However, desperation can cause even the firmest minds to doubt. When the family opened up about their situation to people they trusted, they realized they were sinking into a double-edged swamp. Sinan wanted the truth at any cost. They knocked on the door of GATA, Gulhane Military Medical Academy, one of Turkey's most established and disciplined institutions. For the psychiatrists facing them, the picture was just as complex as it was for the family. The offer made by the psychiatrists started the most unforgettable and shocking part of the story. "We are going to turn your house into a laboratory." GATA's technical team placed recording devices equipped with night vision in every corner of the house. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. Any anomaly occurring during the night would be captured on those tapes. Signatures were signed and cameras were installed. There was no longer anywhere to hide in that house. Everything would be recorded on tapes to be watched by assistants arriving every morning. The gravity of a scientific institution was preparing to witness one of the darkest found footage cases in history. For the first 2 days after the cameras were installed, there was a false sense of peace within the home. On the third night, that scientific observation suddenly transformed into a living nightmare. When the tapes reached the clinic, those watching froze at what they saw. In the recordings, Ceyda was slammed to the floor in the deepest part of her sleep, as if thrown from the bed by a giant hand. When she stood up, her face was again lost in the darkness. Then a sharp sound of a slap echoed through the air. Ceyda's face was whipped to the side. The fresh red handprint appearing on her face with the morning light was now evidence that medicine could not explain. Seeing that the situation was spiraling out of control, the doctors assigned a soldier to the house that night. On the fourth night, a dark shadow in the corridor was clearly reflected on the tapes. Then came a cataclysmic noise from the kitchen, the clattering of shattering plates, drawers opening and flinging themselves out. When the soldier rushed to the kitchen in terror, he screamed that he never wanted to serve in that house again after what he saw. But his request was denied. The fifth night was the final act where all boundaries were crossed. The electricity in the house flickered on and off. Hums rose in the darkness, the sounds of objects being thrown, and a woman in the corner completely disconnected from the world. When the lights came back on, the duty soldier was lying lifeless on the floor. With each passing day, the family's walls of reality were crumbling one by one. On the sixth night, the observation inside the house turned into a display of horror. Those moments recorded by the cameras were a case unprecedented in medical literature. Ceyda was standing at the foot of the bed, her hair thinning and her head bowed. That murmur was no longer a voice, but a mechanical hum. At the very second Sinan woke from his sleep and approached his wife, the cameras bore the darkest witness in history. When Sinan looked into the eyes of the woman he held by the arms, what he saw was not his wife. The face before him was stretched, the features had hardened, and it was filled with the rage of a man. The sound coming from the throat of that thin, delicate woman was a thick, non-human male voice. Sinan pushing her away, the shock he felt in that moment, and the black hole-like memory loss that followed. Seeing Sinan return to bed, and lie down in the footage as if nothing had happened, terrified even the observing psychiatrist. The seventh night was the point where everything peaked. The lights in the house began to flicker as if the power was being drained by force. Lights flashing like a lightning strike, followed by total darkness. The final sounds reflected in the recordings. Furniture being tossed left and right, screams and a suffocating silence. The cameras stopped at that point. All that remained were the files that would enter the GATA archives. Cases medicine dismissed as severe psychosis, yet could never explain physical realities like objects flying through the air. Psychiatrists diagnosed Ceyda with severe psychosis and prescribed heavy medications. However, these drugs only served to numb Ceyda's consciousness. While science attempted to suppress the symptoms, the true entity within that house maintained its silence from the moment the recordings ended. Psychosis is an abyss where the fabric of a person's reality shatters and the mind accepts its own hallucinations as the only truth. But Ceyda T was not a case of psychosis. The file was stamped unresolved. Yet this case was not destined to be forgotten in dusty archives. Born in 1976, Hassan Karakada walked through the doors of GATA when those dark tapes were still fresh. As a medical student, he was among the first to examine the files. Karakada eventually left his medical education behind and headed to Japan. There he studied the dark, restless aesthetic of cinema that shows the unseen. When he returned to Turkey, he laid the foundation for a work that everyone would watch as a horror movie. Karakada's claim hit the film industry like a bombshell. The movie contained actual footage taken from that house. While audiences looked at the screen in terror in theaters, they did not know what they were actually watching. Those flickering images on the screen, those surreal movements, they were the very seven-night nightmare that scientists in an Ankara home had desperately captured on camera. Today, millions of people think Ceyda T's story is just a movie script. The horror on the screen was, in fact, the reality in that room. The finale is this: the tragedy of Anneliese Michel, sealed by court records, and the legend of Ceyda T, carried to the silver screen, are actually two faces of the same fear. One is an ancient darkness that history tried to explain with a religious ritual, and the other is a darkness the modern world tried to explain with an experiment. The cold church walls of Germany, a quiet apartment in Ankara. Anneliese bid farewell to life in a body that had dropped to 30 kilograms with an indescribable hatred for everything sacred. And Ceyda, following those images trapped on tape, faded into silence with the same thirst, the same wasting away, and the same inevitable end. Their stories were adapted for the screen, became the subjects of films, and were the focus of academic theses and legal files. Some called it exorcism, others called it severe psychosis, but both scream the same truth. Their bodies, souls, and lives were seized by a power that transcended the boundaries of medicine. So, which one is the truth? The world you think is real is actually much darker than it appears. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. Until we meet in the next Lost Fact, keep pushing the boundaries.